All right, you have the handout before you. We are tonight talking about outlining the text. If you started on that, keep doing that because I'm going to repeat for the sake of this going on YouTube. And some are watching and some are just now signing on to Zoom. Repeat what we just mentioned a moment ago. If you're just signing on or just now listening, this letter that you see on the screen before you, you can download that at our website, elbethelchurchofchrist.com. You can go to class schedule. Click on class schedule, look for Hermeneutics class, click on that and look for lesson 5 and the activity sheet if you want to follow this exercise. This letter that you have before you and that you're reading and still working on is just a fictitious letter. We're going to pretend that it's much longer because this is quite simple, 4 paragraphs, but we're going to illustrate a point and we'll come back to this and illustrate some things later on. I think you'll find the exercise helpful to illustrate. I didn't do it with a biblical text for a purpose. So if you have read this and you are reading this letter, we're looking for, as the instructions suggest, read this letter and you look for thought patterns. By thought patterns, we just simply means a shift in subjects and list those in the box. So if I've not read the letter and I'm asking you, what was this about? What was the first subject? If the first subject was a fishing trip, then that's what you write down. If he shifts gears in the next paragraph and talks about his Christmas shopping, then write that down. That's your second thought pattern. But that wasn't it. So what was the first thing you see he talks about? This is Bob who's writing this letter. Talks about his health. All right. So I observe in the first paragraph that he's talking about his health. Did he shift gears or is the whole letter about his health? Shifted gears. What did he talk about next? Family. So the second paragraph, he talks about family. Is that all the letter talks about, or does he shift gears again? What does he do now? What's he talk about? Work or his job. All right. Is that all he talks about, or is there another shift? Talks about the church. All right. Here are 4 things. Do you see what we just did? We just made an outline. Now, maybe on a 4-paragraph letter, you don't need an outline, but let's just pretend this was 4 pages or 40 pages, and we're trying to get a grip on what this letter is about, and we just saw 4 thought patterns. We just made an outline. That's what we just did, and that's helpful to us. All right, now I'm ready to look at that and ask, what do these 4 categories have in common in this letter? Or does he just randomly shifting? Or he talks about himself and his wife? Say again. All right, he's talking about things are much better in all of these categories, didn't he? So that's the thing they have in common. Now, this is what I do with a Bible text. I take a text, and once I get my basic outline, I'm stopping before I get through with that. What do each one of these sections that I have outlined have in common? Or do they have anything in common? And in this case, everything's better in all 4 of these areas. Now, I might go a little further. If I ask you what the letter is about, you can say it's about his health, it's about his family, it's about et cetera, et cetera. But let's go a little bit further. What did he say about his health? Let me start you off. He's recovering from surgery. Didn't he say that? And he goes on to mention his headaches are better. We're talking about how things are better. And he mentioned something else. He went back to work, and the scare with reference to his blood work ended up being nothing. So that gives me, I'm subdividing that now, and that's giving me a little better perspective of what he's saying about his health, don't I? Have a pretty good perspective of that. All right, what did he say about his family? Well, he said children are doing better in school. Say anything else? The remodel's over, and because the remodel is over and because the wife's family circumstance is better, then his wife's stress level is better. Didn't he say that? And consequently, they're spending more time together. So here are 3 areas where the family is better. Now, you might outline it differently, but does that pretty much, that gives us the gist of what's going on. Let's move on to work. He had a change in jobs, and this is a better job. And he said several things about that. Now, let's go about church. What did he say about church? There are at least 3 things he said about church being better. They appointed elders, but before that, he mentioned several place membership. They've also had several baptisms, and they just appointed 3 elders. So do you see now I have a pretty good perspective of what this letter is about? I just outlined it. Now, this outline is going to help me because let's just assume you probably knows the reference. Look in paragraph number 3, the second from the last sentence. He said something about he has more PTO. Let's assume we don't know what that is. So I go over here. I know I've heard Mitchell mention that, and I said, Mitch, I know you work around tractors. I heard you talk about PTO. What is PTO? And he's probably going to tell me that stands for power takeoff tractors. That's all I've ever heard, PTO. Let's try that in the context. Does that fit in this context? Now, that's kind of absurd here, but what I'm saying is there are going to be words you think it has this meaning, but it doesn't fit this context. So I asked somebody that works at a factory, and they said, now, PTO stands for, does that fit in this context? Now I know what PTO means, because it's right in this context of his work. Does that make sense? That's how we interpret text. That's how we interpret text. So before we get into that, I'll just remind you this Bible challenge we're doing. Hopefully you're keeping up with looking at 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and reading that. Now let's talk about the basic level of hermeneutics we keep going. And within that basic level, we've talked about the text, reading the text, reading the text, reading the text. We spent a couple of weeks looking at context. We're still dealing with context. Tonight we're dealing with context, but we're focusing on structure and thought patterns. We haven't left basic level. If you've got a Bible, you're staying at the basic level of Bible interpretation, and we're reading the text, we're looking at the context, and we're going to look for a little structure here. And so we're going to talk about all of that. Now, tonight we're talking about outlining the text. We'll do that again next week, and then we'll get into Bible study aids. Here's what we're going to see. We're going to split this in 2 lessons. We're going to talk about what is an outline, the value of an outline, and our goal is true textual outline. And that's all this week, and then next week we'll look at the other 2 about how to make an outline and some examples of outlines and how that works. We're going to look at a little examples tonight. So let's get underway. Let's talk about what is an outline. What's your answer to that question? What is an outline as it pertains to what we're doing here?
It's a way to organize content by its meaning.
All right, very good. Way to organize content by its meaning. Anybody else? Well, the American Heritage says it's a summary of a written work or speech usually analyzed in headings and subheadings. That's pretty good. It is a summary of a speech or maybe a written document. In our case, it's a written document, the New Testament or Old Testament for that matter, usually analyzed in headings and subheadings. Another definition is a short summary of main topics and principal ideas of a written work or speech. Now, it's a way of organizing thoughts or ideas. It's a way of organizing thoughts or ideas. And you may be sitting here wondering, I don't see the benefit of all of this. We're going to talk about that next. But let's get what it all is all about first. It's a way of organizing thoughts or ideas. Now, this is important because we're going to go both directions here on this, and you'll see what I mean by both directions. A writer may make an outline, that is an organized collection of the thoughts that he wants to say, before he writes his article or book. I do that for every article, every book I write. I've got an outline. I may throw it away, but here is an outline. I'm going to deal with this, and then sub-points, these 3 points, and then here's another sub of that. Here's this, and that's how I'm going to write, and never write without an outline. All right. He's taking his ideas from an outline to a written document. But we can also do that in reverse. We can take the written document and turn it back into an outline. And that's what we're doing when we outline the writings of the New Testament. We're taking the text and trying to turn it back into an outline so we have a good grasp, just like we did with the letter a while ago. Make sense? Now, there's value in that, and we're going to talk about that here in just a moment. So you can take an outline, turn it to a written text, but we're taking the written text and turning it into an outline. Now, here's a sample outline over here. It doesn't have any real substance to it other than main point, subpoint, etc. What an outline is, it's a list of thought patterns, and it's the organizing of thought patterns. It's the organizing of thought patterns. And what that does is it gives us a summary of what that's all about, what that text was all about, that chapter, that book, whatever we're outlining. All right? Let's go a little bit further. Let's talk about the value of an outline. You tell me. You're wanting to study Romans 2. and you read it and you read it and you don't have an outline and you don't intend to have one, but somebody else has an outline and you see it, what value is there in that outline?
Leaving stuff out or forgetting to cover all the stuff that you want to cover. You originally, when you thought, you organize it, you put it on paper. By putting it on paper, you don't forget to cover some of the stuff that you want.
Good point. Good point. I like what Peter Kroll said. He said there must be high demand for Bible outlines since they show up everywhere. Almost every study Bible outlines the book. Almost every commentary has a central outline. Most sermons and study guides outline their passages. And most introductory essays on books of the Bible share a few key topics like date, author, audience, key themes, and, you guessed it, an outline. They show up everywhere. Everybody uses them. Not everybody knows how to make them, but everybody benefits from them. Now, let's talk about the value. It organizes information and makes it useful. Now, bear with this illustration. We do some pretending here. So let's pretend you've just been hired for a new job. And the new job you have is you're going to run a clothing store. And your first day on the job, you're shown a storefront. All you have is this empty building, and right in the middle of the building is a pile of clothes. I'm your first customer, and I come in, Dickie, and ask, do you have men's dress shirts? What are you going to tell me? Why do you not know? Just a pile. Do you ever look at a chapter of the Bible when you start into it and it just looks like a pile of verses? Your cursory reading of it is just a pile of verses. What's there? If I ask you, is there anything in this chapter on faith? If you haven't really read it and studied it, you don't know yet, do you? But let's do a cursory reading of that, and you say, yeah, I remember seeing something about faith. Well, was that the main thrust? Well, you may not know yet, because you just kind of made a quick run through that. So what are you going to do now as the new store manager? All right, what do we do? Start sorting. So if someone comes in and said, do you have ladies' dresses? I'm not sure. I think I saw some in there. So I'll help you go through these. We start going through and we see some men's clothes, so we make a category for men, we make a category for women. That may be all we've got, but suddenly we come up on some children's clothes, we automatically make a third category, don't we? Pretty simple. That's not hard. So now we've got three piles, and I come in, Dickie, and ask him, do you have women's clothes? And he said, yeah, there's the pile right there in the middle. Can we do better than that? All right, we're going to subdivide, and maybe we just subdivide them by suits and shirts and pants and casual, and the same thing with women's clothes, and the same thing with children's clothes. Can we do better? We might organize them by size. Yeah, we might organize and arrange them by size, and then we might start hanging them on the racks. So we hang them on the racks. We might even make us some category headings like men's, women, and children. Make sense? So now I come into Dickie's store, and I don't have to ask him, do you have men's clothes? I can look, here's a major heading, men's, and I can see that he's got it organized by suits and then dress shirts and pants and et cetera, et cetera. And women's over here got all that categorized. Now what I'm suggesting to you is sometimes an approach to a text is it's just, particularly Proverbs. You ever read Proverbs and it looks like just a dump truck full of verses just piled, they're unrelated. You can sort them out and hang them on the rack. What we're doing in outlining is taking verses and hanging them on the rack. That's all we're doing. And that's going to help us in interpretation. And I'm going to show you how that's true as we go further. So here we have an outline here of, you can't read the details of that, I'm just representing an outline. That's 2 Timothy 3, perilous times. And so since you can't see that, I'll tell you it has four major sections. The characteristics of the perilous times, 1 to 5, how evil men advance the perilous times, 6 to 9, and Paul's example during the perilous times, 10 to 13, and the response to perilous times, 14 to 17. See, what I've done is I've taken the verses and hung them on the rack. Does that make sense? Put them in a useful category. All right. What that does is it helps me to see what I have. Like hanging the clothes on the rack, I now know what I've got. I now know what I've got in this chapter. It's not just a pile of verses anymore. I've got some organization to that for my study. What else does it do? It's going to connect thoughts together. In other words, it's going to connect, for example, the characteristics with the remedy for the times, like in this passage. So what does verses 1 to 5 have to do with verse 16? Has everything to do with my understanding of verse 16. Because I see the connection when I organize them. Make sense? We get to know the text better. Just like that letter, remember that letter? Now I know it's got 4 categories. I have a better understanding of this letter because I have my 4-point outline of that letter. And if I want to know more details, I can drill down. Here were the 3 things he said about work. Here's the 3 things he said about church. I have a better understanding of that. I'm getting a better understanding of the text. If you're a teacher, the last 2 points here apply to teachers. If you're teaching, it makes driving a point home much easier when you have some structure. Make sense? Here is a verse that really needs to be driven home to this class, but you don't want to look like you went way out of your way to pinpoint some particular person, but when you just deal with the next verse, it makes application much easier. And if you're a teacher, it helps in deciding what you're going to say next. Have you ever put your own material together, those of you who teach? And maybe you're saying, I want to talk about sin, and so let's talk about characteristics of sin. Now, what do I want to say next? You got to think a little bit. You take a text, I know what I'm going to say next, whatever Paul said. That's my next point. What am I going to say after I deal with characteristics? I'm going to talk about how evil men advance and promote the because that's what he said next. What am I going to end with? On the response to the perilous time, because that's where he ended that. Does that make sense? So it's going to help me with my text and understanding it and in making application. Here's the value of an outline. It identifies boundaries. What do we mean by that? Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Let's go back to this outline of 2 Timothy 3. Verses 1 to 5 deal with the characteristics because I've looked at that and I've outlined it. And I know at verse 6 he starts another thought. It just set my boundaries there. Does that make sense? So when I'm wanting to study about characteristics of the time, I know my boundaries are in verses 1 to 5. Or does it go through verse 14? No, it stops at verse 5. That thought. So I want to know what was Paul's conduct in that time? The boundary is set at verses 10 to 13. So if I'm wondering, what's Paul talking about his own conduct? Was he talking about that in the first part? No, he's talking about that at 10 to 13 as I've outlined that. Just like the boundaries of men's suits are right here. It's not over there in that section, it's right over here. This is the boundaries of it. Make sense? All right. What else does it do? It helps me gain control of the text. Now, what do I mean by control? Does this ever fit you? Until I outline a text, I feel like the text is a little out of control, like the pile of clothes. Remember the pile of clothes? My store is out of control. I don't have control of it. I don't know what I've got. I don't know where things are. I don't know how many garments I have of men's dress. I don't know how many women's dresses. I don't know. But once I organize, I know exactly what I've got. I've got control of my store. So once I outline my text, I feel like I've got control. I picture an outline like this literally in my mind. If I have a text I haven't taught much before, and I'm working with it, I feel like it's out of control till I get an outline of it. And once I do, I feel like I've got handles on that. I've got control of that chapter. Does that make sense? All right, now let's take this letter we had, and that's why we did this. Come back to it. Once I had my outline, I feel like I've got control of this. I know what this is about. I've got good control of this letter. So just pretend it was a 40-page letter, and I've got my 4 points outlined. I've got good control. Somebody says, I'm not going to take the time to read all that. Tell me what it's about. I've got control. I can tell you what it's about. Make sense? All right, same thing with the text, with the New Testament text. All right, it shows relationships of things in the text. It'll show the relationship of the chapter to the book. That is, an outline of the book is going to show me how chapter 12 fits with the entire book. It's also going to show me how a section may fit with the chapter. And it may show me how the verse fits with that section or with the chapter. So let's go back to our text in 2 Timothy 3. Here is a verse that talks about being disobedient to parents. You say, oh, is he talking about the family? No, he's talking about characteristics of the perilous times, and that fits into that section. See, I now know what that verse is all about because it fits into this section dealing with the characteristics of the times. He was listing characteristics he wasn't listing characteristics of the family. He was listing characteristics of the perilous times. That's what he's doing. Make sense? All right. Here's something else it does. It gives you a better view of the text. How does an outline give you a better view of the text?
See how things are connected.
Shows how things are connected. Once I get this outline done of my text, it gives me a good preview of what I'm going to study the next time I study that. It also gives me a view or a guide or a map or a compass and shows me where I am. So I decide I'm going to be studying 2 Timothy 3, and I stop off at verse 10. When I pick back up, I look at my outline and I see where I am. I'm right here talking about not the characteristics of the times. I'm talking about Paul's conduct in the midst of those times. That's where I am at verse 10. All right? And it also gives me a review and ties it all back together. Here's where we've been. I've been over these 4 points. My letter, here's the 4 areas where things are better. And now I can review that. Make sense? That's what we're doing with outlining a text. It is an aid to interpretation. How does it aid in interpretation? This is a key to why this fits in this class. All right. If you didn't catch what Drew said, you get an overall picture of what the text is about, and then you see what a particular section is about or what a particular verse is about. So, just for kicks, let's go back to this outline right here of 2 Timothy chapter 3. Got 4 major sections in that chapter. So now that I've read it enough that I've outlined it, I now know that all of these verses 1 to 5 deal with the characteristics of the times. There may be a word I don't understand, but I know it fits into that category. Does that make sense? I may not know what heady means. I need to look that up. I may not know what's meant by incontinent. I know what that means, but how does it fit here? I may need to look that word up. But I'm understanding it has to do with the characteristics of the times. Make sense? Now, I'm going to make a statement here that you may not agree with, but give it time, and I think you're going to agree with it. When you have outlined a text, 1/2 of your job of interpretation is accomplished. Partly because, in order to get that outline, I've had to do something that we've been emphasizing over and over. What have I had to do? Read and reread and reread and reread and reread. And so every time I'm reading, I'm getting more information about what the text means. 1/2 of my job of interpretation is accomplished. Now, there's a word here I may not understand. Here's a phrase. There may be a verse. I'm not sure how exactly what he's saying in this verse, but I know it has something to do with the characteristics of the times. Or I may know it has something to do with Paul's conduct, but I'm not sure what he's saying. I've got to do some studying on that. But 1/2 of my work of interpretation is accomplished, and I hadn't even cracked the first commentary yet. Hadn't even opened the first commentary yet. Don't need to yet. I'm going to use that, but not yet. Make sense? This is still a part of context. We're looking at the context over and over again. Now, I want to encourage you to do this. I think you'll find this helpful. If you take an outline that you created, and the value of your own created outline is it fits you and your wording and your style, and so you may like my outline, fine, use it. But if you want to change that and tweak that or organize a little differently, that fits your style. And when you write that in the margin of your text, that's going to be beneficial for years to come. That's actually a copy of my Bible. That's Acts 2, and there's notes all around. So that when somebody asks me, well, tell me about a certain chapter, I throw open, I say, well, the first 5 verses, I don't remember that. I can read. And I can read my outline. And that helps me to put things in context, because I don't remember every detail of every chapter. So when somebody asks me a question about Acts 15, okay, the first 29 verses is talking about a discussion at Jerusalem, and here's what, here's the problem described in verses so and so. I now know what that context is. Make sense? Very, very, very helpful. All right, anything else on the value of an outline? I want to talk about true textual outline, and then we're going to go to our text for tonight. Does it make sense, the value that an outline has? Now, we're going to talk about how to do this next time, but I'm not expecting everybody in here to be the kind of person who ends up with a masterpiece of an outline. That's not what we're after. But if you can do with the text what you did with this letter and say, you know what, I saw this point, and then I saw a second, and then I saw a third, and I saw a fourth, and I've got that down, I just made an outline, didn't I? And I can do that with the text, with the chapter. I'm beginning to organize things, and that's helping with my interpretation. All right, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the goal here is what I call a true textual outline. So what is a true textual outline? This is not merely where you're taking some points that you see in the text. What I mean by that, you might open up, say, Romans 2 and say, I see here's some things that I learned, that God is a fair God, verse 4. God doesn't show partiality, verse 11. God is a God who brings men into judgment. Here's 3 things I learned about God. That doesn't tell me a thing what the whole chapter's about. I just learned 3 things. Nothing wrong with that. May do a sermon like that or a class. But that's not a true textual outline. What a true textual outline does is map the flow of thought of the author. It makes every verse of that chapter fit into your outline. Why do I need every verse? Because every verse is in that chapter. I'm trying to outline this chapter. Make sense? I'm going to try to make it all fit. It analyzes the complete text or the complete chapter, whatever it is I'm studying, or the complete book if I'm outlining the book. So let's go back to this 2 Timothy 3. It had 17 verses. It made all 17 verses fit. Now, I could build a study around 2 Timothy 3 and talk about Paul's manner of life and just build it around 10 to 13. Nothing wrong with that, but that doesn't give me the true flow of the whole context. I'm wanting to know what the whole chapter's about. And so that's why I put every verse in there somewhere. Just like every garment has to be picked up off the floor and hung on the rack. Don't leave anything laying on, don't leave any verses on the floor. Pick them all up and hang them on the rack. Make sense? That's a true textual outline when we're trying to interpret the text. What we're doing is creating an outline from which the author may have worked. Let that sink in for a moment. You're trying to create an outline from which the author may have worked. Here's what I mean by that. Let's pretend this is the outline that Paul used to write 2 Timothy 3. I don't know that he had an outline, but I know it was very organized. So if nothing else, the outline was in the mind of God because it was very organized. But let's just pretend that Paul had an outline from which he wrote 2 Timothy. So I'm reading 2 Timothy 3, but I don't have that outline anymore. So what I do is I take that written document and I create an outline that I think is there. What I'm trying to do is create the outline that I think would agree if we could find that. Suppose archaeologists said, we have found the outline from which you wrote 2 Timothy 3. What I'd be fascinated to know is if my outline agrees with that. You see what we're trying to do? And we're doing some pretending. So let's pretend there was this outline, and what if we could find that? Am I making something that just hits or stabs at the text, or am I trying to create something that reflects what he may have written from? That's what I'm trying to create. And if I can create something that I think this would have, if you had to rewrite 2 Timothy, I could take this outline and rewrite it and pretty much get close to what it says, then I have a pretty good understanding of the text, don't I? Make sense? This is the first night you've looked lost. Are we lost? You don't know if you're lost. All right. That's what we're trying to do. Here's some basic rules of textual outlining. Now, we're going to talk about how you do that, but let's talk about basic rules before we get to that next week. You want to outline the text as it was intended for the original reader. The outline does not necessarily reflect a lot of interpretation, but it reflects what the text is saying. That makes sense? Here are the characteristics of the times. What does heady mean? You don't necessarily reflect that in your outline. You'll do that as you read and interpret or teach it or whatever. But you're trying to understand what was being said to the original reader. All right? You want to seek to fit every verse and every thought into the outline. But here's point number 3 is very important. You're not making up an outline, you're trying to find it. What's the difference? Let's go back to this document here. I'm not trying to make an outline like what would I say if I were Bob about things being better. I'm going to let Bob tell me what his outline is. He's already given me the outline because he shifted gears 4 times, and that's when I made 4 points. Bob gave it to me. I've got to search for it. I had to read it to find it. He didn't give me an outline. He gave me a written document, but I have a pretty good idea of an outline he would have written this from. Make sense? So what I'm doing in the New Testament, I'm not making up an outline like, what on earth could be my 4 points, or do I want to have 3 points? Let the text tell you whether there's 3 or 4 and what the next point is.
Donnie, we tell the kids, find the big idea.
That's right. You want to find the big idea. I may go in reverse. I may look for these points and then see how the big idea ties those all together. Remember, we had 4 points, and then I want to know how they all related. All related in the sense that it says things are better. There's the big idea. I think you're right about that. Look for the big idea in that. What is he driving at? What's the point? Making sense? You're going to find the outline, and when you do, I know you probably don't believe me now, but if you take a text you've never outlined and you outline that, half of your job of interpretation will be accomplished. I guarantee it. You'll come back 3 months from now and say, you know, you're right. And I think you'll find that to be true. All right. Now, next time, what we're going to deal with is how to make an outline. How do we go about doing that? You're saying, this is confusing. I don't know how to do that. We're going to go step by step through that. And then we're going to give some examples of outlines. All right? Any questions? Comments? All right. No questions or comments?
Got one for you, Donnie.
Yes, sir.
How would you differentiate when you're looking at a shift in thought from saying, I believe that is a new heading, versus I believe that is a new subheading?
That's tough sometimes. And one of the things I'm going to get into next time is as I do an interpretation, I try to interpret the text first before I get any help from somebody else. I try to outline it myself first, and then I go and look at other people's outlines to see if they can move me, and sometimes they do. Sometimes I realize they have taken what I thought were these 2 major points, those were subpoints under another heading, and I think, okay, I see that. Let me go back and read that again, see if that's there, and if I'm convinced of that, I'm going to change to that. If I'm not, I'm going to stick with what I thought. And so the point I guess I'm looking for, you may outline it with 2 subheadings, and I'm making them 2 major headings. We end up at the same spot, but I'm trying to figure out as I read that, are these 2 verses here fitting as a subpoint of that, or are they talking about 2 separate things? I've got to make that call somewhere, and that's a tough call sometimes. Mike and I argued over that. I don't mean argued, but went back and forth as we outlined several books while he was here, and I'd say, well, I think verse 5 fits here, and he said, no, I think verse 5 fits there. Well, I don't think so. I believe it fits over here. And we go back and forth until one of us would convince the other, or we just say, well, we just leave that. I don't know if that helps, but we'll try to talk a little more about that next time. All right, let's go to a tough passage, 1 Corinthians chapter 11. If you are thinking that the assignments are dealing with tough passages, we don't need help with simple ones. So guess what? We're left with the tough ones. And that's what we're going to deal with. This is a tough one. And the question is, and not all of these passages, but some of these are ones that have been submitted to me I asked for some input, and this is one. So I really want to focus on what the text says, but I also want to focus on the process of going through. That's what we're trying to learn, is the process. And not just give you a fish, I want to teach you how to fish. So the question is, 1 Corinthians 11, 14, and 15, do these verses teach that it's wrong for a man to have long hair? Is it wrong for a woman to have short hair? And does this apply today, or is it just cultural? Well, the first thing we probably ought to do is just read the text. So let's open up to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And get verse 14 and 15, because that's the verse in question. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. Now, we do some pretending in this class, so let's pretend that we have read this text, the chapter. We've read it through, we read it through again, we read it through again, and so we've done all that, okay? We have to pretend, because if we do that now, then this is all we're going to do tonight. So let's pretend we've done that. Now that I've read it, what's the first thing that I want to do in trying to understand this text? Well, what have we talked about for 2 weeks? Well, before we get to the outline, I'm looking at the broader an outline is part of the context. All right? So what's the context dealing with here?
Addressing problems in Corinth that have probably been written to him. He's going through this.
All right. The broader context is that he's dealing with some problems that the Corinthians have addressed to him. Everyone pretty much agrees, every commentator, every student pretty much agrees that verse 1 of chapter 11 goes with the previous chapter. And chapter 11, verse 2 starts a new thought pattern. And verse 17 starts another thought pattern concerning the Lord's Supper. So our boundaries were just set by an outline here. Here's where outline comes in. 2 to 16. And 2 to 16 deals with headship and submission to authority is shown by the wearing of the head covering. I'm not going to get into whether the head covering is binding because it's law for all times, or it's a matter of custom or a matter of spiritual gifts. What we're going to say about verse 14 will apply to any one of those three interpretations. So I'm not going to get sidetracked. Not that I'm not willing to discuss that, I'm just not going to get sidetracked tonight on that. Now, he argues at verse 14 and 15, obviously, and everyone would agree, that even nature teaches that a woman's head should be covered. That's his argument, is women's head ought to be covered. And he argues that even nature teaches that. What is nature? Well, that's something we're going to have to deal with. But all I'm looking at right now is the context. Is the context helping me at all? And it is helping me. I'm understanding the flow. I'm understanding the argument being made. I'm wanting you to see the process. Is that making sense? I'm going to read, and read. I'm going to look at the context. I'm going to look for my boundaries. And so if I don't have an outline, at least I will notice a boundary. That's another subject back up here at verse 1. Verse 17 is another subject. My boundaries are 2 to 16, pretty much. Make sense? That's my boundaries that were set. What else am I going to do? Trying to understand this text. All right. That's dealing with the context, so I'm going to read all of verses 2 to 16. I might read the chapter before to see if it had anything to do with this, and I'm going to find out it didn't. I might read from verse 17 on for another chapter or two. It had nothing to do with this. So again, my boundaries were pretty much set in 2 to 16. And so here we are dealing with the headship, and even nature teaches you something about that. All right? I might harmonize this with other texts. One of the questions is it wrong for a man to have long hair? Is it wrong for a woman to have short hair? Is that what this text is saying? I don't have time to go into all of this, but God has always established a distinction in men and women. In the Old Testament, you say, well, that's Old Testament law. That doesn't apply. I didn't say it applied. I'm just saying Deuteronomy 22, in the Old Testament, God drew a distinction, said that women and men were not to wear the same kinds of things. That's all I'm trying to show, that God had made distinctions in men and women. You say, well, that's all Old Testament. Okay. Come to the New Testament, and there was the condemnation. The King James uses this word effeminate. Look at the word effeminate up. Some translations will say homosexual, and it does deal with homosexuals. But look at your lemma definition of the word that's translated, and it will have something to do with feminine-looking boys. Check Logos definition in their lemma discussion. But I'm not interested in that right now. I'm just showing there's a difference in men and women. All right? Do you think maybe a study of the word nature would help us? Nature is used a number of ways in the Bible. I don't have time to trace all of those. Sometimes nature has reference to long-established practice. We are by nature the children of wrath, Ephesians 3. Do you think we were born that way? No. Long established practice. But sometimes nature can have reference to the order of things, how things happen in nature, that men and women are different by nature. All right? So, again, let's pretend we've had time to do some study. I'm going to look at verse 14. Nature teaches that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor. It says nature teaches that, whatever nature is. And nature teaches that if a woman has long hair, it's for her glory. And I'm beginning to understand that much of my understanding hinges on this word nature, doesn't it? So let's define our word. And we'll get into defining words a little bit later. M.R. Vincent, these are lexicographers. These are not commentators. I'll share a commentator in a moment, but these are lexicographers. BDAG, that's Bauer, Danker, Art, Gingrich, and A.T. Robertson, and M.R. Vincent. Vincent says it's the recognized constitution of things. A.T. Robertson says here it means native sense of propriety in addition to mere custom, but one that rests on the objective difference in the constitution of things. Says almost the same thing that Vincent says. They often agree, by the way. BDAG says it means regular or established order of things. So these lexicographers seem to think that the sense of the word nature is not talking about nature in the sense of a long established practice, but the constitution of things, just like men and women are different by nature. Nature made us different. Just the way things are. Nature makes a distinction in the length of hair of men and women. I won't read all of this. This is Lang, Peter Lang, John Peter Lang, in his work. If you have Willis's work on 1 Corinthians, he quotes from Lang. But this is directly from Lang, and I'm not going to read all of it, but it basically tells you that what he says is that nature teaches us that this is the matter of long-established practice, etc., and it's a matter of the constitution of things. He quotes that basic definition. But he talks about this toward the end, that the former yields a good sense, as we understand it denotes here the natural constitution of the sexes and the richer growth of hair in the women. Several commentators make this observation, that men can grow long hair. That's admitted by Paul, verse 14. Didn't say it was right, it says they can. It's possible. And women can have short hair and even be shorn, that is shaved off and be bald. They can do that. Doesn't mean it's right, just means they can. But generally speaking, these commentators, Lang, Linsky, I think, makes the same observation, that generally if you had like 100 men and 100 women, and everybody just let their hair grow for 10 years, that women generally would have longer hair than men. That's the natural constitution of things. Make sense? Now let's go back to our text and see if we can make some sense of this. I'm just showing you the prompt. What would I do in working through this? How have I come to the conclusion I have? Is I want to look at the context, first of all, and did it help me? It helped me, but it didn't tell me everything I wanted to know. I want to look at this word nature, and I did. So let me stop and pause and say, does this passage apply today? That was one of the questions. Well, if it doesn't apply, then what does that mean? That means men could grow hair down to their waist and no problem, and women could shave their head and be bald and no problem. I'm not sure anybody here believes that. So, let me go a little further. What about the question of how long is long? When somebody raises that question, how long is long and how short is short, they do the same thing with modesty. That reminds us of a lawyer one time. What did he say? Who said that? Yes, sir. Exactly. Luke 10:29. Who is my neighbor? Meaning, nobody can define it, so therefore it doesn't apply. That's what he was saying. So who can define long and short? I want to suggest to you that the text doesn't seem to be implying that that's measured by inches, but by comparison. That he's showing a difference between men and women, that nature even shows you that it's shameful for a man to have long hair and it's shameful for a woman to have short hair. That she was not to be shorn or shaven. And so if I say that if the hair is touching his ears, he's doing wrong, or if it's just a little over his ears, it's wrong, or if hers is up to her ear, that it's wrong, I can't draw that line. But by comparison, the text is saying that a man is not to have long hair and a woman is not to have short hair. By comparison. And that's as far as I can go with the text. And you say, I think you ought to go further. Find me another text, because I can't do it with this one. I can't do it with this one. Does that make sense? I didn't answer all your questions. I didn't answer all of mine. I'm trying to grapple with the text. What I want you to learn is the process. I want you to learn the text, but I want you to learn the process. Does that make sense? I want to look at the context. I'm going to look at definition of words. And we'll talk about use of commentaries, but I want to go to that commentary to see if he can give me any evidence. I'm not looking for the interpretation as much as I am, what does he say it means, and what's his evidence that it means that? Because if he can't convince me, I'm not going to follow him. But if he can show me it means that, and here's the evidence, I'm interested in that. Does that make sense? Let's go back to our fictitious letter. I don't know what PTO means, but if somebody can cite me where that is used and give me evidence, this is what it means, now I know. Because they gave me some evidence, not because somebody told me. Does that make sense? Same thing with this. Questions or comments? Tough passage, is it not? It either has no application, and so do what you want to. Shave your head off or let it grow down to your knees, makes no difference. Or it does have application, and we've got to grapple with the fact that some specifics are not given, but by comparison. Generally, what would pass for the length of a woman's hair, a man ought not to have. Or what would pass for the length of a man's hair, a woman ought not have. I think is the general rule learned from that text. All right, more about outlining next time.